Welcome learners. In this session, we are going to study about the contemporary trends in social psychology. An historical study of trends in social psychology is an ambitious sounding endeavor that should ideally be qualitative and quantitative, theoretical and empirical, and predictive and descriptive. Such a study could legitimately be undertaken using any one or a combination of the approaches provided by the sociology of science, the social psychology of science, or the psychology of science, the sociology of knowledge, and the philosophy of science. The objective of this session is to explain some of the current trends in social psychology, discuss the emergence of cognitive psychology, describe the idea of social constructionism in psychology, and differentiate between cultural psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and indigenous psychology, and understand their significance. Elucidate the feminist movement in psychology and describe the relevance of positive psychology. First, we should begin with the current trends in social psychology. Social psychology is ever developing science. Various journals of social psychology publish research done in this area. Some of them are Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Journal of Applied Social Psychology are some examples. It must be clear by now that after passing the middle of 20th century and moving in the 21st century, it was evident that the discipline of psychology was going through a transition. To be specific, psychology that involved identifiable and contrasting systems of psychological investigation transformed into emphasizing on data collection and towards the empirical roots of psychology. This transition of the universal rejection of adhering to specific systems did not take place suddenly. Instead, there was a tendency to investigate specific issues which reflected a specific research strategy. The systems themselves were less likely to dictate significant issues. Trend in contemporary psychology is that it tends to redefine, substantiate areas of the study. This takes place either by specializing within psychology or attempting to associate the traditional psychological issues with some other discipline. Newer specializations have often emerged because of the psychologists being demanded to bring about changes in functional roles. Current trends in psychology are also towards inter and multidisciplinary studies rather than exclusive specializations. The acknowledgement of common methodologies and the breaking down of the barriers of traditional discipline has indeed brought two or more disciplines together in order to address a given issue. The advancement of the technical sophistication of the scientific inquiry has further accelerated this trend of making the traditional approaches to become obsolete and inadequate. Some of the recent advances in psychology that are dominating contemporary social psychology are cognitive psychology, social constructionalism, cultural and cross-cultural psychology, feminism, and positive psychology. Cognitive psychology. Couple of decades back, cognition and behaviorism were considered as two different kinds of things in psychology, but it no longer exists. Cognition and behavior are currently considered as intimately linked and related approaches. Since cognitive psychology emerged at a time when behaviorism was dominating, a good way to understand the nature of cognitive psychology is to differentiate it from behaviorism. Cognitive psychologists emphasize on the process of knowing and not simply how individuals respond to stimuli. The important factors for cognitive psychologists are mental processes and events and not the stimulus response associations, emphasizing on the mind instead of the behavior. Cognitive psychologists do not ignore behavioral processes, but understanding those processes is not solely their goal of inquiry. The behavioral responses are viewed as a source to make inferences and draw conclusions about the mental processes that accompany them. Additionally, cognitive psychologists examine the ways in which the mind organizes experiences. The tendency to organize conscious experiences in a way that it makes meaning is innate. The subject matter of cognitive psychology is then the way in which the mind makes the mental experiences coherent. In contrast to this view, the behaviorists argued that the mind does not possess any such innate organizing abilities. Further, according to the cognitive psychology, the individual is an active agent that arranges stimuli in the environment in a creative manner. Cognitive psychology suggests that human beings actively participate in the acquisition and application of knowledge, deliberately attending to some events and choosing them to commit them to the memory. The behaviorists, on the other hand, never believed in the idea of human being active in the environment. They always claimed that humans passively respond to the external events. They are like blank slates on which sensory experience will write. Next, we shall see about the social constructionalism. Social constructionalism focuses on the meaning and power. Meaning is not a property of the objects and events themselves, but a construction. Meaning is the product of the prevailing cultural frame of the social, linguistic, discursive and symbolic practices. Individuals and groups interacting together in a social system over a period of time form concepts or mental representations of each other's action. These concepts eventually become habituated into reciprocal roles played by the actors in relation to each other. The roles are made available to other members of the society to enter into and play out the reciprocal interactions that are said to be institutionalized. In the process of this institutionalization, meaning is embedded in society. Therefore, knowledge, conceptions and beliefs of what reality is becomes embedded in the institutionalized fabric of the society. From the perspective of the social constructionalism, knowledge and the systems are inherently dependent upon the communities of the shared intellectuality and vice versa. They are governed to a large degree by a normative rules that are historically and culturally situated. The criteria which are invoked to the identity behaviors and events are largely circumscribed by culture, history and social context. Social constructionalism therefore locates meaning in an understanding of how ideas and attitudes are developed over time within a social community context. All knowledge evolves in the space between people and in the realm of the common world. An individual thus develops a sense of identity or inner voice only through the ongoing conversations with intimates. Social constructionalism considers an individual to be an integral part of cultural, political and historical evolution in specific times and places. Consequently, psychological processes are viewed cross-culturally in social and temporal context. Apart from the inherited and developmental aspects of humanity, social constructionalism suggests that all aspects of humanity are created, maintained and destroyed in interactions with others through time. The social practices of life begin and are created in the present and eventually end. Next, the cultural, cross-cultural and indigenous psychology. Psychology has always been a heterogeneous discipline. Within psychology, a number of moves towards embracing the idea of culture have been found. When looking at the past, the idea of culture in psychology can be seen to have begun from the educational and developmental concerns of the 1980s, which mostly used the idea of Vygotsky as the center of their new efforts. However, by 2010s, the efforts of social psychology are also considered both in Europe and the United States, where the generic label social becomes frequently taken over by the culture. The rapid movement of the messages and people that has made the former images of the homogeneous classes that dominated cross-cultural psychology either moot or problematic. The tradition of comparing societies, that is, countries being relabeled as cultures, has become an accepted practice in cross-cultural psychology. Empirical comparisons of the averages of samples from different culture can bring out interesting charting data for further analysis by cultural psychology. All this is supported by real life social changes. Specifically, globalization has in a way brought cultural foreigners to be the next door neighbors. The issue of making sense of their way of living becomes of interest for the already established colonists of the given place. The world has now changed from what it was in the last century. People now have close interactions with the cultural others, and all social psychological adaptations to this innovation acquire a cultural accent. Contemporary social psychology emphasizes to examine such social events that carry complex cultural accents. This effort of uniting culture and psychology that has been taken place from the 1990s to the present time is not actually the first time in the history of psychology. It has been observed in the recent 2 decades that multiple efforts have been made to introduce the aspect of culture into the science in general. Likewise, psychology begins to enter into cultural arenas in many new ways that were never imagined. The emergence of the culture in psychology led to viewing culture from 3 different approaches. They are cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology, and indigenous psychology. The term cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology, and indigenous psychology are each fussy a concept with partially overlapping sets of the exemplars. In the cross-cultural psychology, culture is generally operationalized as an antecedent variable. In the paradigmatic instances of such an approach, culture is implicitly viewed as being outside of and apart from the individual. Culture and human activity are seen as separate entities. In cultural psychology, in contrast, culture is not seen as an outside of the individual, but as inside in an important way. Culture is a way of knowing, of constructing the world and others. Through process of interaction and communication, these constructural acquires a certain degree of intersubjectivity or shared meaning. Shared knowledge and shared meanings generate a set of everyday practices that also define culture. Thus, culture and behavior and culture and mind are viewed as indistinguishable. The method often used in cross-cultural psychology is to take a procedure that has been established in one culture with known psychometric properties and compare it with one or more cultures. In cultural psychology, instead of using established procedures and making comparisons, methodological procedures are derived for each culture from the life ways and the modes of communication of that culture. Unlike cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology derives its problem and procedures from an analysis of the nature of culture. In cross-cultural psychology, culture is viewed as an antecedent or an independent variable. It examines culture as an index instead of a process. In a similar manner, cross-cultural psychology views the individual as a dependent variable. This dependent variable usually functions as indices of individual cultural processes such as cultural activities and social interactions. The individual is not viewed as constituting to the processes themselves, as can be found in cultural psychology, because cultural psychology emphasizes on the processes of a particular culture. It does not use measures with pre-established psychometric properties, which can be often found in cross-cultural psychology. Cultural psychology, in contrast, has developed its own toolkit of methods which include ethnography and discourse analysis. These methods have been adopted from anthropology. The first emphasis in cultural psychology, the symbolic quality of culture, is shared at least in spirit with indigenous psychology. Although indigenous psychology and cultural psychology have very clear independent origins, they share the notion that the prime subject of the study is the individual's creation of meaning systems, particularly systems that are shared or normative within a defined cultural group. In different ways, both traditions have recognized that psychological theories are important aspects of shared cultural meaning. In the recent times, cultural psychologist John Miller has at theoretical level asserted the cultural grounding of all the psychological theory. This cultural grounding of theory has been a strong motive, if not an explicit meta-theoretical statement, for indigenous psychology. The unique contribution of indigenous psychology is that both concepts and theory should be developed within each culture. Unlike indigenous psychology, however, the empirical research tradition of cultural psychology has not been based on formal psychological theories with culture-specific origins. Cultural psychology, instead, in the past few years has focused on developing ethno-theories of psychological functioning and using that to form a discipline for empirical investigation. Indigenous psychology aims to go on one step further. The goal of indigenous psychology is to take informal folk theories of psychological functioning and formalize them into psychological theories. Cultural psychology arrived at the empirical study of folk theories, including in particular folk theories of psychological development. Indigenous psychology has in turn moved ethnopsychology from an object of empirical study to a source of formal psychological models. In other words, indigenous psychologists have taken steps to translate ethno-theories of psychology into formal theories of psychology, and from these theories to conduct empirical psychological studies. Cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology and indigenous psychology, their definitions and aims. Cross-cultural psychology examines the similarities and differences in psychological functioning in different cultures and ethnic groups. The aim of cross-cultural psychology is to develop a psychology that is more in terms of inclusiveness and universalism. It is about comparing thoughts and behaviors in different cultures. Cultural psychology is about understanding the individuals in the historical and socio-cultural context. The aim of cultural psychology is to develop an understanding of how the mind and culture influence each other in specific contexts. Indigenous psychology is the study of people in a specific cultural context. This is done by scholars in that context for the benefit of the people in that context. The aim of indigenous psychology is the development of a psychology that is not entirely universal, which has meaning and application in specific cultures and ethnic context. Next, we shall move on to feminism. Feminism is a range of social and political movements that aim to define and establish social, economic and political equality of the sexes. The feminist movement provided the political and intellectual momentum for overarching changes in many areas, including the discipline of psychology. Feminists who were also psychologists and psychologists who became feminists used this momentum to move their concerns from the periphery of the discipline to its center, effectively staking out a new field and new disciplinary presence. Psychologists have posed questions about sex and gender in virtually every area of psychology. Feminism has always centered on ending the subordination of women and encompasses a wide range of additional ideas, theories and practices. Among feminist psychologists, this spectrum is fully represented. A key strength of feminist movement in psychology is that diverse points of view are brought into interaction, leading to productive intellectual interchange and new developments. Feminist psychology and the concept of gender. In 1979, the feminist psychologist Rhoda Ungar introduced the term gender to psychology. She defined gender as those characteristics and traits socioculturally considered appropriate to males and females. The term was intended to set social aspects of maleness and femaleness apart from biological mechanisms, so it can be scientifically scrutinized. This definition by Ungar is considered to be important in that time. However, in today's time, Ungar's definition of gender is just one of many definitions that are used. Some have argued for putting aside the definition of gender as a set of traits of individuals in favor of view of gender as socially prescribed set of relations. Feminist theorists have conceptualized gender that go beyond the perspective of simply individual differences. Gender has been seen as a complex set of principles, a meaning system that organizes male-female relations in a particular social group or culture. Gender has also been viewed as a marker of status, hierarchy and social power. Other feminist theorists have conceptualized gender as a set of practices that create and enact masculinity and femininity in mundane social context and in social institutions such as language and law. Positive psychology. After the Second World War, the discipline of psychology turned its attention to healing. It concentrated on repairing damage but gave emphasis to the disease model of human functioning. This almost exclusively attention to pathology neglected the idea of a fulfilled individual and a thriving community. The consequences of this was that the idea of building strength, which is viewed as being highly effective in therapy, was completely ignored. It is within this setup that positive psychology emerges from. The aim of the positive psychology is to accelerate change in psychology from a preoccupation with only repairing the worst things in life to also developing the best qualities in life. In order to compensate for the previous imbalance, psychologists suggested that developing of strength must be at the forefront in the treatment and prevention of mental illness. The field of positive psychology at the subjective level is about positive subjective experiences. This includes the experience of well-being, satisfaction, flow, joy and happiness. It also includes having constructive cognitions about the future, that is the hope and optimism. Positive psychology as a discipline can be viewed at both at the individual and the group level. At the individual level, positive psychology emphasizes on positive personal traits. This includes the capacity for love, courage, interpersonal skills, aesthetic sensibility, perseverance, forgiveness, originality, future-mindedness, high talent and wisdom. At the group level, positive psychology focuses on the civic virtues and the institutions that move individuals towards being a better citizen, which includes responsibility, nurturance, altruism, civility, moderation, tolerance and work ethic. Positive psychology can thus be defined as a scientific study of the positive aspects of human subjective experiences, of a positive individual traits and offer positive institutions. As such, it proposes to improve the quality of life and also prevention of the various pathologies that arises when life seems to be barren and meaningless. Happiness. The central topic in positive psychology is the study of happiness. Philosophers have debated that the definition of happiness for thousands of years, but have not been able to come to a proper agreement. Aristotle described happiness as a realization of one's potential and referred to it as a critical ingredient of life. Bentham, on the other hand, has suggested that happiness is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. Contemporary theorists have suggested that happiness emerges when several specific life conditions are met. These may include self-acceptance, environmental mastery, personal growth and relatedness. Others, however, suggest that happiness is the average experiences of pleasure and pain. The term happiness is used interchangeably with the subjective well-being, the subjective evaluation of one's life. This is said to be relatively stable feeling of contentment with one's life. It involves cognitive evaluation and positive affect that emphasizes on life satisfaction, relationship quality, meaning and achievements. This aspect of happiness represents the highest level of hierarchy of happiness. The next level of hierarchy comprises of 4 components, that is the pleasant emotions, unpleasant emotions, life satisfaction and domain satisfaction. Each of these can be further subdivided into specific aspects of life experiences like love, worry, meaning and health. After this, the next level of hierarchy is the conscious experience of happiness. Researchers have also distinguished between the eudaimonic and hedonic happinesses. Eudaimonic happiness is about the meaning and purpose, taking part in activities that allow for actualization of one's skill, talent and potential. Hedonic happiness is about the high frequencies of positive effects, low frequencies of negative effect and evaluating life as satisfying. Conclusion. After passing the middle of 20th century and moving in the 21st century, it was very evident that the discipline of social psychology was going through a transition. Current trends in the social psychology are also towards the inter and multidisciplinary studies rather than exclusive specializations. Cognitive psychology focuses on feelings, perception, imaging, memory, problem solving, thinking and all other mental activities. A social constructionalist inquiry is mainly concerned with elucidating the process by which people come to describe, explain or otherwise account for the world in which they live. The emergence of culture in psychology led to viewing the culture from 3 different approaches, that is the cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology and indigenous psychology. In cross-cultural psychology, culture is generally operationalized as an antecedent variable. In the paradigmatic instances of such an approach, culture is implicitly viewed as being outside of and apart from the individual. In cultural psychology, in contrast, culture is not seen as outside the individual, but as inside in an important way. Feminism is a range of social and political movements that aim to define and establish social, economic and political equality of the sexes. The field of positive psychology at the subjective level is about positive subjective experiences. This includes the experiences of well-being, satisfaction, flow, joy and happiness. It also includes having the constructive cognition about the future, that is hope and optimism. Thank you.